The paper was worn soft at the folds, thin as onion skin from being opened and closed 1,000 times, and when Olive Doyle snatched it out of Aaron Hale's vest pocket, her hands were shaking so badly she nearly tore it in half. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more terrifying than a shout. The candlelight in the small back room of the Dusty Creek Trading Post threw wild shadows across the walls, and Aaron stood there with his jaw set and his gray eyes steady, not flinching, not reaching to take the paper back. Just watching her, just letting her read it. It was a list. Her family's name, written in handwriting she did not recognize, appeared at the top. Below it dates. Below the dates towns: Amarillo, Santa Fe, Tucson. 3 states, just like the rumors she had half dismissed as local gossip when she'd first arrived in the New Mexico territory. The name Doyle was written in pencil in the middle column beside each entry, circled once, with small notations beside it that she couldn't fully decipher in the dim light, but one word kept appearing beside her family's name: debt. "How long?" she said, and her voice cracked on the second word. "How long have you been carrying our name around like some kind of what, like a bounty sheet, like a ledger?" Aaron Hale did not look away. He never looked away, which was one of the things she had learned about him in the 6 weeks since he had ridden into Dusty Creek with nothing but a horse and a bedroll, and the kind of silence that made people ask questions they weren't sure they wanted answered. "For years," he said. The word hit her somewhere behind the ribs. "For years," she repeated, and the betrayal was so sharp and so sudden that she had to grip the edge of the wooden shelf beside her to keep her balance. "4 years, and you rode into this town, into my town. You sat at my family's table, you let me—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She would not finish that sentence because finishing it would require her to admit things she was not yet ready to admit. Things that had been growing quietly in her chest for weeks, like a fire someone keeps feeding without acknowledging that it is a fire at all. She set the paper down on the crate between them and smoothed it with one hand, a gesture so controlled and deliberate it looked almost calm. "You need to explain this to me," she said. "Right now. From the beginning." And Aaron, she looked up at him then, and her dark eyes were fierce and steady and wet at the corners. "You had better tell me the truth." It had begun, as so many things in the New Mexico territory began in the summer of 1882, with a horse and a man who looked like he needed water. Olive Doyle had been standing on the front porch of the Doyle family general store on the main road through Dusty Creek when Aaron Hale had ridden in from the east, coming down the long straight stretch of packed red dirt that passed for the main thoroughfare of their small community. She noticed him because of the horse first, a dark bay with good legs and an easy rolling gait, the kind of horse that had been cared for properly over a long distance, which told her more about the rider than his face did at first glance. Then she noticed the rider himself, tall in the saddle, lean in the way men got when they lived outdoors for years, not thin from want but economical from habit. He had dark hair gone a little long at the collar and a 3-day beard, and a face that was weather-beaten and honest and impossible to immediately place. He reined in at the water trough in front of the store without theatrics and let his horse drink, and then he swung down and stretched his back in that slow, automatic way of a man who had been in the saddle since before sunrise. He looked up and found her already watching him from the porch. "Good afternoon," he said. "It was until the dusk came," she replied, which was her standard response to strangers, not unfriendly but not exactly an invitation either. He almost smiled. She caught the very edge of it before he suppressed it and took off his hat and dragged a hand through his hair. "I was told there might be work here. My name is Aaron Hale." "Olive Doyle," she said. "And who told you about Dusty Creek?" "Man in Albuquerque. Said a woman named Doyle ran the general store and the post office combined, and sometimes needed extra hands for the supply runs." She studied him for a moment. She had a talent for reading people that she had developed out of practical necessity, rather than any natural gift for intuition, running a small business in a frontier town in 1882. "Meant that your survival often depended on making quick and accurate assessments of the strangers who came through your door. What she read in Aaron Hale, standing in the July heat beside his horse with his hat in his hand, was this: tired, careful, self-contained, and carrying something heavy that wasn't in his saddlebag. "Supply run leaves Thursday," she said. "If you can handle a team and you don't drink on the job, we can talk terms." "I can handle a team," he said, "and I don't drink." He had stayed. That was the thing about Aaron Hale that nobody in Dusty Creek could entirely account for, including Olive herself. Drifters came through all the time, took a few days of work, moved on. Aaron Hale took the Thursday supply run and came back and took another one. He was clean, quiet, and frighteningly competent. He could fix a wagon axle, calm a spooked horse, navigate by stars, and negotiate fair prices with suppliers in Albuquerque who were accustomed to taking advantage of smaller frontier operations. He made no enemies and offered no personal information, and somehow managed to make himself quietly indispensable without ever appearing to try. The town of Dusty Creek had a population of approximately 200 souls in 1882, enough people that a newcomer could maintain a certain anonymity, but few enough that every individual still registered in the collective awareness of the community. The old women who ran the quilting circle discussed Aaron Hale with great interest and no reliable data. The blacksmith Eli Marsh, who was a fair judge of character, told anyone who asked that the new man seemed all right. The sheriff, a competent and unhurried man named Frank Beckett, ran no particular interference because Aaron Hale broke no laws and filed no trouble. And Olive, who told herself she was simply assessing a new employee, found herself noticing small things about him with an attentiveness she would have found alarming if she'd examined it too closely. The way he always returned her father's wagon with the team already watered and the harness cleaned. The way he listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, he said things that were actually worth hearing. The way he looked at her sometimes when he didn't think she was looking back, not with the usual mixture of speculation and assumption that most men in frontier towns directed at single women who owned their own businesses, but with something quieter and more complicated, something that felt almost like recognition, as though he had known her before and was simply confirming that she was still exactly who he remembered. Her father, Thomas Doyle, had died 2 years prior. The store, the post office contract, and 4,000 acres of hard red land outside of town had passed to Olive and her younger brother, Cal, who was 20 and better with horses than with accounts. Their mother had died when Olive was 12. Their nearest relative was an uncle named Silas Doyle, their father's older brother, who lived somewhere in Texas, and whom neither of them had seen in 7 years. Olive was 26 and had been managing the store on her own, effectively, for the last 3 years of her father's declining health and the 2 since his death. She was organized, unsentimental about most things, quietly fierce, and though she would not have said so herself, profoundly lonely in a way she had built a very effective wall around. The store was her wall. The work was her wall. The careful, measured distance she maintained from the increasingly pointed suggestions of the town's eligible bachelors was her wall. Aaron Hale, without appearing to do anything at all, had been making a door in that wall for 6 weeks. It had started with conversations. Not the transactional kind, supplier prices and route conditions, and how long the new axle was likely to hold up, but real conversations that crept up on both of them in the quiet hours of the store after the day customers had gone home. He had come in one evening to drop off the supply receipts, and she had been sorting the mail, which arrived 3 times a week from Albuquerque, and they had ended up talking about books. She kept a small lending library along the back wall, which was unusual enough for a frontier general store that travelers often commented on it. And she had discovered that Aaron Hale had read more than she expected and thought about what he'd read in ways that were careful and original and occasionally startling. That had been the first conversation. The second had been about her father, which surprised her enormously because she never talked about her father with anyone. But Aaron had asked a question, something simple and genuine about how long the family had been in the territory, and she had found herself answering more fully than she intended, and then more fully than that. And by the end of the conversation, she had told him things about Thomas Doyle and what it had been like to watch a strong man diminish that she had never spoken aloud to another person. He had listened with his whole attention the way some people never learn to do, and when she was finished he had said, quietly, "He sounds like a man who knew what mattered." She had looked at him then in the lamplight of her own store and felt something shift underneath the careful architecture of her daily life, subtle as a fault line. She had not said anything. She had returned to sorting the mail. He had taken his leave with his hat and his quiet and his 3-day beard, and walked back to the room he rented above the livery stable. And Olive had stood for a long time afterward in her empty store holding an envelope she'd already read, and thinking about the way his voice sounded when he said something he meant. The weeks that followed had a quality she would later describe to herself as walking on new ice, that combination of excitement and terror, each step taken with care but the forward momentum undeniable. They were not courting in any formal sense. There had been no declared intentions, no visits with proper chaperones, no flowers or formal correspondence. But there was the third conversation and the fourth. There was the afternoon he fixed the broken shutter on the back window of the store without being asked, and without making anything of it. There was the evening he stayed to help her reorganize the supply shelves after a particularly chaotic delivery. And somewhere in the middle of shifting crates and tallying inventory, she had laughed at something he said, and he had looked at her with that expression again. The quiet, complicated one that made her feel like she was being recognized rather than simply seen, and she had thought, "I am in real trouble here," and immediately afterward, "I don't mind." There had been 3 days before she found the paper in his pocket, what she privately classified as the moment she stopped pretending she didn't know what was happening. It had been late evening and the store was closed, and she had been working on the accounts at the front counter, which was positioned near the window that looked out on the main road. Aaron had stopped by to return a set of keys she'd loaned him for the storage shed. He'd come in the back way because the front was locked, and she'd let him in and then gone back to her accounts while he set the keys on the counter. And instead of leaving immediately, he'd stopped and looked at what she was working on and asked a question about the quarterly figures. And she had explained the problem she was wrestling with, a discrepancy in the supply costs versus what she was charging that was slowly eroding her margin. And he had sat down across from her, and they had worked through it together for the better part of 2 hours. At the end of it, when the problem was solved and the correct numbers were written in her ledger in her own careful hand, she had looked up and found him closer than she'd realized, both of them leaning over the counter, and the candlelight was doing something unfair to the lines of his face and the particular gray of his eyes, and for a moment neither of them moved or spoke. The air in the room was very still. The distance between them was very small. She had said his name. Just his name, quietly, barely a sound. Aaron. And he had pulled back just barely, just enough, and the expression on his face had been complicated. She could not read it fully. There was something that looked like wanting and something that looked like the active restraint of wanting, and underneath both of those things something else, something darker and less comfortable, something that looked almost like dread. "I should go," he had said. He had gone. She had lain awake half the night trying to understand what she had seen in his face. 2 days later, she had been restocking the tobacco shelf behind the counter when she had knocked his vest off the hook near the door. He'd hung it there when he came in out of the heat that morning, and she'd been meaning to hand it back to him, but kept forgetting. And the paper had fallen out of the pocket and landed face up on the floor, and she had picked it up purely out of the practical instinct to return misplaced items. And she had read the first 3 words, and the world had changed. Now she stood in the back room of the Trading Post with the paper between them and Aaron Hale's steady gray eyes on her face, and the full weight of whatever this was landing on her chest like a stone dropped from a great height. "The beginning," she said again, very controlled, very quiet. "Tell me from the beginning." He pulled a stool from under the workbench and sat down on it, which she appreciated because it took away the height difference and made the conversation feel less like an interrogation and more like two people attempting something difficult together. He folded his hands between his knees and looked at the floor for a moment and then looked at her. "My father," he said, "was a business partner of your Uncle Silas Doyle." She had not expected that. She kept her face still. "Go on." "In 1878, my father, his name was George Hale, entered into a land contract with your uncle. The terms were straightforward. Silas provided the capital to buy a parcel of land in East Texas. My father provided the labor to develop it and work it, and they were to split the profit. That was the agreement." Aaron's voice was level, careful, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this in his head many times and was choosing to deliver it as plainly as possible. "Silas defaulted on the agreement after 18 months. He took my father's share of the profits, he filed altered paperwork with the county land office in Tyler, and he had my father prosecuted for trespass on land that had legally, up until 6 weeks before, been my father's own." Olive was very still. "What happened to your father?" "He died in the county jail in Tyler, Texas, in the fall of 1879. The conditions were poor. He was not young." A pause. "He was 61. She felt something that was not quite guilt and was not quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it with a specificity that had nothing to do with the instinctive comfort of the phrase. "I was 23 when he died," Aaron said. "I had been working a cattle operation in Colorado when it happened. By the time I got to Texas, the legal situation was unresolvable. Silas Doyle had friends in the county government, and my father's name had been effectively erased from the original paperwork. I couldn't fight it in court. I had no money and no connections, and the law, such as it was, had already ruled." He looked at the paper lying on the crate between them. "I started trying to find Silas to confront him directly. He had left Texas by then. I tracked him to New Mexico, then Arizona, then back to New Mexico. That paper is my record of where I'd found evidence of him or the Doyle name over the past 4 years. Supplies purchased on credit in Amarillo under the name Doyle. A land survey filed in Santa Fe listing Silas Doyle as a party of interest. A lawsuit in Tucson where the name appeared in court records." He paused. "I want to be clear about something." "Please," she said, and there was an edge in it. "I was looking for Silas," he said steadily. "Not for you, not for your brother. Not for your father, whom I knew had died. When the man in Albuquerque mentioned a woman named Doyle running a store in Dusty Creek, I came here because I thought Silas might be using this town as a base of operations or might have some connection to it that I hadn't found yet." "And did you find that connection?" "I found that your uncle has been here," Aaron said carefully. "Not recently. But 3 years ago, shortly after your father died, there is a record at the Albuquerque land office of Silas Doyle making inquiries about the Doyle family land holdings in the Dusty Creek area. There are 4,000 acres, Olive. Good grazing land, better than it looks on a survey map because of the underground water. He was asking about it." The room had become very small and very cold despite the July heat pressing against the walls. "He never contacted us," she said. "After my father died, there was no word from Silas at all. I assumed he may be waiting," Aaron said, "or he may be building a case. I don't know what he intends, but I know what he's done before and I know what he's capable of." Olive stood very still for a long moment. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" It was the heart of it. Everything else was context. This was the wound. Aaron was quiet for a moment and she watched him decide how to answer honestly. "'Cause when I rode into this town I had one purpose and it had nothing to do with you personally. And then I met you." He looked at her directly. "And it became harder to separate what I had come here to do from what I was beginning to." He stopped. He started again. "I didn't know how to tell you without it sounding like I was using you, and I wasn't. I want you to know that. But you were watching us, she said. This whole time, you were watching this family. I was, he said. Yes, I won't lie to you about that. The honest acknowledgement hurt more and less at the same time. She had not known that was possible. And the conversations, she asked, and her voice was very quiet now, almost private. The evenings in the store, the accounts, all of that, was any of that, Olive? His voice had changed. The careful, measured quality was still there, but underneath it now was something raw and unguarded that she had not heard from him before. Nothing I said to you in those evenings was calculated. Not one word. If anything, you are the reason I stayed when I should have moved on. You are the reason I couldn't simply gather what I needed and leave. He looked at her with that expression again, the one she had seen in the lamplight. Only now she could read the dread in it correctly. It was the dread of a man who knew he was about to have everything he wanted taken away from him by his own history. That is a more frightening admission than anything on that paper. She sat down on the edge of the other stool and looked at the paper for a long time without speaking. Outside, the sounds of Dusty Creek's evening drifted in through the cracks in the trading post wall. A dog barking somewhere on the south end of the road. The distant knock of a hammer from Eli Marsh's smithy, which ran late sometimes. The faint music from the saloon 2 buildings down, fiddle and the shuffle of boots. What were you planning to do, she said finally, when you found Silas? Confront him, Aaron said. Make him produce the original paperwork or sign a declaration admitting what he did. I had spoken to a lawyer in Albuquerque who said that if I could get a signed admission or the original documentation, there might still be a legal remedy, even after all this time. The land in Texas is gone, Silas sold it years ago, but the admission itself would clear my father's name. That's all you want, she looked up at him. After 4 years. My father's name, he said very simply. Yes. There was something so uncomplicated and so dignified about that answer that she had to look away. She looked at the paper again, at the list of towns, at the word debt written beside her family's name in those careful penciled columns. And she thought about something she had not yet told Aaron, something she had been carrying herself quietly for the past 3 months. There is a letter, she said. Aaron went very still. It came 8 weeks ago. I haven't told anyone about it, not Cal, not Sheriff Beckett, no one. It came from a lawyer's office in Santa Fe, and it was addressed to the Doyle family estate. She reached into the front pocket of her apron, where she had taken to keeping it because she didn't know what to do with it and didn't want to leave it unattended, and she unfolded it and set it on the crate beside his paper. Aaron picked it up and read it, and she watched his face change. The letter was from a firm called Merritt & Sons, attorneys at law in Santa Fe. It informed the Doyle family that their uncle, Silas Doyle, had filed a petition with the New Mexico Territorial Court, claiming partial ownership of the Doyle family landholdings near Dusty Creek on the basis of an alleged verbal agreement with the late Thomas Doyle. The petition claimed that Thomas had promised Silas a half interest in the land in exchange for financial assistance during a period of difficulty in 1874. The letter informed Olive and Cal that they had 60 days to respond with counter-documentation, or the petition would proceed uncontested. 8 weeks ago. The 60 days were nearly gone. Aaron set the letter down with the quiet of a man exercising great deliberate calm. You've had this for 8 weeks. He said. I didn't know what to do with it, she said. I don't have documentation that disproves it. My father he never mentioned any agreement with Silas, not to me, not to Cal, not to anyone I can find who knew him. But that doesn't mean I can't prove a negative. No, Aaron said, but I might be able to prove a pattern. She met his eyes. You're talking about your father's situation. Silas Doyle has done this before, Olive. In Texas in 1878, he used a nearly identical strategy: alleged verbal agreements, altered documentation, claims against a deceased party who could not defend himself. If I can produce the Texas land records, the legitimate originals that I have copies of, signed by witnesses who are still alive, and pair them with this petition, I can demonstrate to the court that this is a pattern of fraud and not a legitimate claim." Something was happening in her chest. It was the feeling of a door opening, a real door, the kind that let in light and air. "You have the Texas documents." "Copies," he said. "Sworn affidavits from two of the witnesses to the original agreement, taken before a notary in Tyler in 1879. I've been carrying them in my saddlebag for 4 years." She stared at him. "You have been carrying evidence that could protect my family's land for 4 years." "I've been carrying evidence that could clear my father's name," he corrected gently, "which happens to also be evidence of Silas Doyle's methods. Your family I didn't know about until I arrived here. But now," she stopped and reconstituted the sentence, "now you do know. And you're offering to use them. If you'll let me," he said, "and if you trust me enough to let me." That last phrase hung in the air between them with the weight of everything that had been said in the last half hour. Trust. She had thought she was building something with this man over 6 weeks, and then she had found a paper in his pocket that had felt like the ground giving way. And now the ground was back, but it was different ground, and she was standing on it with different information. And the question of whether she trusted Aaron Hale was not simple, and was not the same question it would have been this morning. "I need to think," she said. "I know," he said. "And I need to tell Cal." "Yes." She picked up both papers, his list and the lawyer's letter, and held them together for a moment. "You should know," she said quietly, not looking at him, "that I am not angry with you for your father. I am not angry with you for tracking Silas. I understand why you came here." "Olive, I am angry," she continued, still quiet, still controlled, "that you sat with me all those evenings and let me talk about my family and my father and my land, and you were carrying information that was directly relevant to all of it, and you chose not to share it." "I know," he said. "You're right. I am also—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She finished the sentence. "I am also not leaving until I understand what I saw in your face 3 nights ago when you pulled back." The silence was different this time, softer at the edges. "That was—" he stopped, tried again. "That was me trying to be honest, not with you, not yet, with myself, about what it would mean to allow myself to want something from a situation that I had built on a hidden motive, even if the motive itself was honest." "Was the wanting honest?" she asked. He looked at her for a long time with those steady gray eyes that never looked away. "The wanting," he said, "is the most honest thing I've done in 4 years." She stood up and straightened her apron and picked up both papers with a businesslike practicality that was entirely undermined by the color in her face. "I'm going to talk to Cal tonight," she said. "Come to the store tomorrow morning, early, before we open." She moved toward the door. Then she stopped and turned back and looked at him one more time. "Aaron, the 4 years, the tracking, the paper in your pocket, I don't say this to excuse the secrecy, because that still needs to be addressed. But for what it's worth," her voice softened, "what your father deserved was better, and what you've done to try to restore it matters." She walked out into the New Mexico summer evening with the papers in her hand, and the sound of that fiddle still coming from the saloon, and the sky going deep pink and gold in the west. And the feeling in her chest was not simple joy or simple anger, but something much more textured than either. The feeling of a person standing at the exact moment when one chapter of their life ends and the next one begins, not knowing yet what the new chapter contains, but understanding, with a clarity that was almost physical, that there is no going back to the page before. Cal Doyle was 20 years old and had their father's hands and their mother's eyes, and a temper that ran about 3 degrees hotter than his sister's, but which he had enough self-awareness to know about and mostly managed. He was in the small stable behind the storehouse when Olive found him, brushing down the gray mare he'd acquired in the spring, and he listened to what she had to tell him with the kind of focused stillness that only appeared when he understood that what he was hearing was genuinely serious. When she finished and showed him both papers, he held the lawyer's letter in both hands and read it twice. "Silas," he said finally, and his voice had a particular flatness that Olive recognized as controlled fury. "I always thought there was something wrong about that man. The way he stayed away after Papa died. I thought it was grief or guilt, but it might have been planning, Olive said. And Hale, Cal looked at her carefully. You trust him? She had been asking herself the same question all the way across the dark road. I think he is telling the truth about his father and about Sila's, she said. And I think the documents he has are genuine. As for the rest, she paused. I think he made a mistake in not telling me sooner. I don't think he made it from a bad place. That's not quite the same as trust, Cal observed. No, she agreed, but I think it's where trust starts. Cal was quiet for a while. He handed the letter back to her. We have about 2 weeks left on the 60 days. What do? We go to Santa Fe, she said. We go to this lawyer's office and we present what Aaron has alongside a formal counterclaim. But first I want to talk to Sheriff Beckett, and I want to talk to Aaron's Albuquerque lawyer, and I want to make sure we understand exactly what we're walking into before we walk into it. And Aaron, does he come with us? She folded the letter back into her apron. That, she said, is a conversation for tomorrow morning. The conversation for tomorrow morning began at 7 o'clock with the eastern light still slanted and gold and cool enough that the day had not yet become the furnace it would be by noon. Olive was behind the counter when Aaron came in, and she had already made coffee on the small iron stove in the back room, which was a small olive branch she extended deliberately, and which she saw him register with the quiet attentiveness he applied to everything. She set a cup in front of him and kept the counter between them for the moment because she needed the surface. I spoke to Cal, she said. And I spoke to Frank Beckett this morning before 6, because he gets up early and I wanted to catch him before the day business started. What did Beckett say? He said that the petition is a civil matter and outside his jurisdiction, but that he knows a man in Santa Fe who works for the territorial attorney's office, and that he would send a telegraph today if I gave him the word. She looked at Aaron. I gave him the word. Something in Aaron's posture shifted very slightly, like a man who has been braced against a weight that is suddenly not as heavy as he expected. Good, he said. I also want to write to your Albuquerque lawyer, she said. Today. If you give me his name and address. Philip Garrett, Aaron said. On 2nd Street, I'll write the letter myself if you prefer. We'll write it together, she said. That small pronoun we sat between them like a fact that had just been established. She refilled her own cup and looked at him over the rim of it. I need you to understand something, she said. Not as an employer and not as whatever else. Just as a plain statement of how I see this. All right, he said. What Silas did to your father was a crime. The fact that the law didn't treat it as one doesn't change what it was. And what he's trying to do to my family now is the same crime run the same way against different people. And I refuse to lose my father's land to the same man who destroyed your father's life. Aaron set his cup down. The morning light was doing the same thing to his face that the candlelight had done the night before, and she noted with a degree of resignation that she was going to have to get accustomed to that. I want to go to Santa Fe, he said. Not as your employee and not on my own account. I want to go because I have been working toward this moment for 4 years and because, he stopped, because I would like to be useful to you. You will be, she said. Your documents are the backbone of the counterclaim. Without the pattern of prior fraud, all we have is our word against a legal petition. With the Texas records, we have documented precedent. There's something else, he said. He reached into his saddlebag. He had brought it with him into the store, she noticed, which was significant, and produced a small bundle of papers folded in oilcloth. He set them on the counter and unfolded the cloth carefully, the way you would handle something that had survived a very long journey and was the only one of its kind. Inside were several sheets of paper, hand-written and signed, with official notary stamps that had aged to brown at the edges. The affidavits, he said. There are 2. One from a man named Robert Caviness, who was present at the original signing of the land agreement in Tyler in 1878, and one from a woman named Muriel Pace, who was the bookkeeper for my father's operation and who kept a duplicate ledger. Olive picked up the Caviness affidavit and read it carefully. Her reading speed was fast and thorough. A life spent managing a postal service alongside a general store had made her an efficient reader of official documents, and when she finished, she set it down and picked up the Muriel pay statement and read that too. "These are good," she said quietly. "These are genuinely good, Aaron." A notarized eyewitness account of the original agreement and an independent financial record that contradicts the altered paperwork. If Philip Garrett is any kind of lawyer at all, he'll know what to do with these. "He is," Aaron said. "He's cautious, which I found frustrating for a long time, but cautious is what we need for a civil proceeding." Olive began to make notes on the back of a sheet of brown paper from under the counter, the quick shorthand she used to organize her thinking. Names, documents, the timeline of Silas's activities in the 3 states as recorded on Aaron's paper, the 60-day window on the petition, the Santa Fe lawyer's address. The shape of the counterclaim was assembling itself in her mind with the same clarity she brought to the quarterly accounts. She was good at this. She had always been good at this, at finding the structure within complicated problems, at knowing which number to change to make everything balance. "We'll need 3, maybe 4 days in Santa Fe," she said. "The filing has to be done in person for a territorial matter of this size. We'll need Philip Garrett to file with us, and we'll want him to present the Texas materials in a way the territorial court will accept. Can the store operate without you for 4 days? Martha Elgin can run the counter," she said. "She's done it before when I've been ill. Cal handles the storage and the orders." She looked up from her notes. "Will you come?" "Yes," he said simply. "Then we leave Monday," she said. "That gives us today and tomorrow and Sunday to prepare everything. I'll telegraph Philip Garrett today and explain the situation. You should write a covering letter to accompany the affidavit so he has the full context in your own words." She paused. "And Aaron, this trip to Santa Fe, it is a legal matter. But I want to be honest with you in the same way I am asking you to be honest with me." He watched her. "I am not going to pretend," she said carefully, "that the evenings in this store have not happened. I'm not going to pretend that the only thing that exists between us is the business with Silas and the legal proceeding. I'm also not ready at this particular moment to call it anything specific or to make any promises about what it means or where it goes. The secrecy was real and it hurt, and I need a little time to stand on the ground that has been rearranged." She looked at him steadily. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," he said. "More than yes." "Good," she said. "Then we start preparing documents." The preparations took the better part of Friday and all of Saturday morning. Olive wrote a long, precise letter to Philip Garrett that outlined the timeline of the original Hale-Doyle land agreement in Texas, the documented pattern of Silas's fraud, the current petition before the territorial court, and the nature of the documents Aaron possessed. Aaron wrote his covering letter in a hand that was cleaner and better educated than most people in Dusty Creek would have guessed, and she allowed herself a private moment of noticing that about him. They sent both letters by telegraph through the Dusty Creek post office, which was her post office, a fact which gave the moment a slightly circular quality that made Cal, watching from the doorway, press his lips together to contain a smile. On Saturday afternoon, with the preparations largely in order and the worst of the day heat beginning to ease toward a breathable evening, something shifted. They had been working side by side at the counter for hours, and the focused efficiency of the work had the paradoxical effect of making the space between them more comfortable rather than less, because they were both in their element, Olive in her organizational mode, Aaron in his methodical, careful way of constructing arguments from evidence. And working alongside someone in their element is an intimacy of its own kind. She made a small error in the timeline she was drafting, transposing 2 dates, and he caught it without making an event of it, simply saying quietly, "I think that should be October of 1879, not 1878, and she checked her source and he was right, and she corrected it, and then they were both leaning over the same page on the counter and his shoulder was very close to hers, and the store was quiet with the late afternoon light going amber through the front window, and Olive straightened up and said, without particular planning, "You should know that I trust you, for whatever it is currently worth." I wanted to say it plainly. Aaron Hale looked at her, and for a moment the careful composure slipped just enough to show what was underneath it. And what was underneath it was a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just been offered a place to set it down. "Thank you," he said, and meant it with the whole of himself. She nodded once, businesslike, and went back to the timeline, and neither of them addressed the fact that they were both smiling. The road to Santa Fe in the summer of 1882 was 130 miles through territory that was beautiful and demanding in equal measure. Red rock and sage, and long flat stretches where the heat haze made the distance look like water. They traveled by wagon Olive's own supply wagon, a solid construction that Aaron had maintained well over 6 weeks of use, with Olive driving one stretch and Aaron driving another, and Cal riding alongside on the gray mare because Olive had decided she wanted him there for the official filing as a named party to the counterclaim. The distance required 2 nights on the road, camped at spots Aaron had scouted from his previous travels. First night, with the Sandia Mountains dark against a sky so dense with stars it looked almost white in places, Cal fell asleep early with the practicality of a young man who had been in the sun all day, and Olive and Aaron sat by the small fire in the particular quality of silence that comes when everything important is about to be said and both people know it. "Tell me about your father," she said. "Not the legal part. The man himself." Aaron poked at the fire once and then set the stick down. "He was a quiet man," he said. "Quieter than me, which is saying something." He had come to Texas from Virginia after the war with nothing except the intention to build something new in a place where the old designations didn't apply. He wasn't interested in ranching. What he loved was cultivating, actually working the soil, making things grow in ground that other people said was too hard or too dry. He paused. He was right, mostly. He had a talent for finding water. And Silas found him because of the land. Silas found him because my father had done the hard work of proving the land was valuable and needed capital to expand it, Aaron said. That was always Silas's pattern, from what I've been able to piece together. He found men who had done the work and provided the money to scale it, and then once the money was in and the value was proven, he rewrote the terms. My father, Olive said carefully, was struggling financially in 1874 when Silas allegedly made his offer. There was a drought the year before. The store came close to folding. She had thought about this several times since Aaron had shown her the list. I was 8 years old. I remember that year was difficult, but I didn't understand the details. If Silas did come to my father in 1874 with money, it doesn't mean he deserves the land, Aaron said. Not if he made a false claim about the nature of the agreement. A loan and a partnership interest are 2 completely different things. I know that, she said. I'm thinking about whether there is any legitimate documentation from 1874 that I might not have found in my father's papers. Any promissory note, any receipt, anything that establishes the nature of whatever transaction occurred between them. Would your father have kept such a document? She thought about Thomas Doyle, methodical, careful, the man who had trained her to keep accounts and the man who had built the small lending library along the back wall of his store. Yes, she said, he kept everything. But I have been through his papers twice since his death and I have not found anything from Silas. Then either there is nothing to find, Aaron said, or Silas already retrieved it. That thought was not comfortable. She let it sit for a moment and then set it aside for the morning because the night was too clear and too warm and too full of stars to spend entirely on Silas Doyle. What will you do, she asked, when this is over? When Silas has been dealt with and your father's name has been cleared and the land in Dusty Creek is secured. She looked at him across the fire. Where will you go? He looked back at her with that steady regard that had characterized him from the first afternoon. I've been asking myself the same question for the last month, he said. For 4 years I've known exactly what I was moving toward. Without that, he paused. Without that specific purpose, I'm not sure what I am. You're a man who knows how to fix a wagon axle and navigate by stars and calm a spooked horse, she said, and who has read more books than most people in the New Mexico territory. You're not nothing, Aaron. I didn't mean it that way, he said. I meant that I am trying to imagine what it looks like, a place to stay, something to build. He was looking at the fire now, not at her, and his voice had the quality of a man thinking out loud, which was a form of trust of its own. I used to know what that looked like, when my father was alive and there was the Texas land and the plan we had for it. Then that was gone, and for 4 years the plan was smaller and harder and all pointed forward to one fixed point. He looked up. And then I rode into Dusty Creek. The fire popped once and sent a small spray of sparks upward into the dark. And then you rode into Dusty Creek, she agreed, quietly. The silence after that was warm and settled, the kind of silence you could rest in. The Doyle land has underground water, she said after a while. That's what you said, 4,000 acres and underground water. That's what the surveys suggest, yes. My father always wanted to do something with the East Quarter. He used to say it was a sin to let that land just sit uncultivated, but he never had the capital to develop it, and he was already spending all his energy on the store. She was watching the fire. The soil out there is very similar to what you describe in Texas. Heavy clay base, minerals, the kind of ground that resists ordinary crops but responds well if you know how to work it. She could feel him looking at her. "Are you saying something specific?" he asked, very carefully, "or thinking out loud?" "I have been," she said with great deliberateness, "thinking very loudly in your direction." The quiet that followed was not empty at all. It was absolutely full. "Olive," he said, and his voice had that quality again, the raw, unguarded quality she had first heard in the back room of the trading post when he had told her the wanting was the most honest thing he'd done in 4 years. "You don't have to say anything right now," she said. "We're in the middle of the road to Santa Fe, and there is a great deal that still needs to be resolved. I am simply saying that when I think about the East Quarter and the underground water and what my father always wanted to do with that land, the person I imagine doing it is not a stranger." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I will not take anything for granted." "No," she agreed, "but you are allowed to hope." The second night on the road she dreamed about her father, which happened sometimes, and woke before dawn to find the sky already beginning to pale in the east, and Aaron on the first watch sitting 10 yards from camp with his rifle across his knees, looking out at the desert, with that alert stillness she had come to recognize. She did not go back to sleep. She made coffee and brought him a cup, and they watched the sun come up over the red rock in a silence that was entirely sufficient. Santa Fe, in 1882, was the oldest continuously occupied city in what would become the United States, a layered, complicated place of adobe and history and dust and political energy that had been a territorial capital since 1851. The plaza was the center of everything. The palace of the governors on the north side, the cathedral of St. Francis still being completed on the east, the merchants and hotels and lawyers' offices arranged around it like a lesson in how civilization concentrates itself around the places where power is administered. Philip Garrett's office was on 2nd Street, a neat adobe building with a whitewashed front and a sign in clean black letters. Garrett himself was a compact, sharp-eyed man of about 50 with wire-rimmed glasses, and the manner of someone who had been surprised by very little in 20 years of territorial law. He read the telegraphed letters, he read the affidavits, he read the attorney's petition, and then he sat back in his chair and looked at Aaron and Olive with an expression that was professionally composed, but which had a thread of something that looked like satisfaction running underneath it. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I have been aware of Silas Doyle as a name in territorial legal circles for several years. He has an unfortunate reputation in Santa Fe as a man who files claims against estates and then settles quietly when the defense is too vigorous to be worth continuing. He tapped the caviness affidavit with one finger. "This is the first time I have seen documented evidence of the pattern across state lines. This changes the nature of the counterclaim considerably." "Can we stop the petition?" Olive asked. "We can do better than stop it," Garrett said. "If we file this as a counterclaim citing fraud, which is what this is, Miss Doyle, a fraudulent petition based on a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation, we can ask the court not simply to dismiss his claim, but to impose costs and potentially refer the matter to the territorial attorney for further action." He paused. "Which means that Silas Doyle, rather than walking away when the defense becomes inconvenient, may find himself facing a formal fraud inquiry." Aaron was very still. "That would include the Texas matter?" he asked. "We would make that case," Garrett said carefully. "Texas is another jurisdiction, and the statute of limitations on the original fraud may be a problem. But the pattern evidence is admissible to establish intent and method, and a referral to the territorial attorney opens a door that your father's situation has not previously had opened for it." The silence in the office had a peculiar texture. Hope tightly controlled, because premature hope in a legal proceeding is a fragile and dangerous thing. "What do we need to do?" Olive said. "You and your brother need to sign the counterclaim documents, which I will have drafted by tomorrow morning. You need to provide me with any records you have from your father's estate that are relevant: tax records, ownership documents, any correspondence you can locate." He looked at Aaron. "And Mr. Hale, I will need a sworn statement from you in my office before a notary, covering the complete history of the Hale-Doyle Texas agreement and your subsequent 4 years of documentation." "When can we file?" Aaron asked. "Day after tomorrow," Garrett said. "I want to do this correctly, and I want to find out something about Silas Doyle's current whereabouts before we file, because I would like the territorial marshal's office to be aware of the situation before any papers are served." Olive reached into her bag and took out a packet of papers she had assembled before leaving Dusty Creek: her father's ownership records, the tax filings for the previous 5 years, the probate documentation from Thomas Doyle's estate, and at the very bottom, something she had found on Friday evening while doing a final search through the cedar chest where her father kept his most important documents. A paper so old and so carefully folded that it had the same soft texture at the creases as Aaron's list. She had not told Aaron about this. She placed it on Garrett's desk. "This was in my father's estate papers," she said. "I found it last Friday. I believe it is relevant." It was a letter from Silas Doyle to Thomas Doyle, dated October 1874, written on paper with a printed heading that included an address in Houston, Texas. It described a loan of $800 from Silas to Thomas, to be repaid with interest over 5 years. The word loan was used 3 times. The word partnership did not appear anywhere in the document. Garrett read it twice. Then he set it down and took off his glasses and looked at Olive with an expression that had abandoned all its professional composure. "Miss Doyle," he said, "your father was a methodical man." "He was," she said. "This letter," Garrett said, picking it up again with something approaching reverence, "states explicitly that the transaction was a loan. Silas Doyle's own handwriting, his own signature, dated 1874. His current petition claims a partnership interest arising from the same 1874 transaction." He looked at them both. A man cannot lend money to his brother and then, 8 years later, claim that the same money constituted a partnership investment in an estate he had no hand in building. "No," Aaron said. "He cannot." Olive sat in the chair across from Garrett's desk with the full release of 8 weeks of tension settling through her in waves that she was too controlled to show fully, but which Aaron, sitting beside her, recognized in the slight easing of her shoulders and the very small change in her breathing. "This is not just a counterclaim," Garrett said, with a quiet precision that felt final. "This is case dismissed with prejudice." The filing took 2 days. Garrett was thorough and unhurried and did not cut corners, and Olive respected that enormously. Aaron's sworn statement took 3 hours before the notary, and covered every detail of the Texas situation in the careful, methodical language of a man who had been organizing this account in his head for 4 years and was finally delivering it to the audience it was intended for. Olive sat in the back of the notary's office and listened to all of it, and when it was done, she was very quiet for a while. Cal, who had been present for the signing of the counterclaim and most of the preparatory meetings with Garrett, took Aaron aside on the evening before the filing and had a conversation with him that Olive was not present for. She did not ask what was said. That evening Cal found her in the small hotel garden where she was sitting with a book she was not actually reading and sat down beside her. "He told me something I think you should know," Cal said. "About the legal matter." "No, about before he came to Dusty Creek. The last place he stopped before Albuquerque, before the man who told him about you." Cal was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for him. He was in Arizona. He had been working a copper mine operation outside Tucson for 8 months, saving enough money to hire Garrett and pursue the legal strategy. He was a month away from enough when he got word, through one of those complicated chains of rumor that seems to cross the territories faster than the telegraph, that there was a Doyle family in Dusty Creek with land that Silas had been asking about. Olive set her book down. "He left the copper mine," Cal said. "Left the job, left the money he'd been accumulating, left the strategy he'd been building for a year. He said," Cal paused. "He said he told himself it was because he needed to see if the Doyle connection to Silas was what he thought. But he said when he was honest about it, he came because he was afraid of what Silas might do to a family that didn't know what he was capable of." Olive looked at the darkening sky above the Santa Fe garden. "He gave up his own timeline," she said quietly, "to come and make sure we were safe. Before he knew you," Cal said, "when we were just a name on his list." She sat with that for a long time. The stars were coming out over the old city, the same stars that came out over Dusty Creek, and somewhere in the night a church bell was striking the hour with slow, measured certainty. "He's a good man," Cal said, with the directness of someone who has been young long enough to still say plain truths without dressing them up. "For what it's worth." "It's worth quite a lot," she said. The filing was done the following morning, Thursday, in the clean-smelling offices of the Santa Fe Territorial Court on the east side of the plaza, with the cathedral bells echoing outside and Philip Garrett presenting the counterclaim with the quiet confidence of a man holding a very good hand at cards. The clerk received the documents, stamped them, and informed them that a hearing date would be assigned within 30 days and all parties would be notified. Garrett, walking them back to his office afterward, told them what he expected. Silas Doyle's attorney would receive copies of the counterclaim documents within 2 weeks. The documents included the 1874 letter in Silas's own handwriting, the notarized Texas affidavits, and Aaron's sworn statement establishing the pattern of fraud. His professional estimation, delivered with restrained but definite satisfaction, was that Silas would withdraw the petition within a week of receiving them rather than face a hearing at which all of that material would be placed into the public record of the territorial court. "And the referral to the territorial attorney?" Aaron asked. "For the fraud inquiry." "I have already written to a colleague in that office," Garrett said. "The decision to pursue that matter independently is not yours or Miss Doyle's. It will be made on the merits of what has been filed. But I believe the merits are significant." Aaron nodded once. His face was composed. But she had been watching his face long enough by now to see what was underneath the composure. And what was underneath, it was the look of a man who has been carrying a weight for 4 years and has just set it down in the right place, finally. And the muscles remember the weight even in its absence. She reached across and put her hand over his, where it rested on Garrett's desk. It was not a large gesture. She did not make anything of it, but he turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them spoke, and Cal, sitting to her right, studied the ceiling with elaborate attention. They began the return journey to Dusty Creek on Friday morning, and the road was the same red rock and sage and distance, but everything else was different. The documents were filed. The petition was as good as defeated. Aaron Hale's 4-year chase had arrived at its resolution, and the shape of his future was no longer a single point on a horizon, but an open landscape with no predetermined direction. The second night on the road back, Cal announced that he was tired before the sun was fully set, with a transparency that would have been embarrassing if it had not been so clearly considerate, and excused himself to his bedroll with the tact of someone twice his age, leaving the fire to his sister and the man who had ridden into their town 6 weeks ago and changed the geometry of everything. "Can I ask you something?" Olive said. "Anything," Aaron said. "What does it feel like, now that it's done?" He was quiet for a moment. "Strange," he said honestly. "I've been moving toward one point for so long that the absence of it feels large. Like a room you've been expecting to be full of furniture and it turns out to be empty." He paused. "But not bad empty, the other kind." "The kind that can be filled," she said. "Yes." She shifted slightly on the rock she was sitting on and looked at him across the fire. "I am going to say something," she said, "and I am going to say it plainly because I have spent the last several years being too careful about most things, and I have recently concluded that carefully avoiding something true doesn't actually make it less true." "All right," he said, and she could see the attention in him, the full focused attention he gave to things that mattered. "I am in love with you," she said. "I have been, I think, for about 3 weeks, though I didn't name it until you showed me that paper in the Trading Post, and I felt what I felt, which was that even in the middle of feeling betrayed and frightened, my primary concern was not the land or the legal problem or Sela's. My primary concern was you. Whether you were actually who I thought you were, whether what had grown between us was real." She met his eyes steadily. "It was real. It is real. And I want to say that out loud where it can be heard." Aaron Hale sat very still for a moment that felt long enough to contain entire seasons. Then he got up from where he was sitting across the fire and came around to her side, and he sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and he took her hand again with the same careful deliberateness with which he did everything. "I have been in love with you," he said, very quietly, "since the evening you told me about your father and then went back to sorting the mail as though you hadn't just handed me something you'd never handed to another person. I didn't name it for another week because I was afraid of what it meant given why I had come to Dusty Creek." He turned to look at her. "I am sorry for the time I wasted being afraid of it." She turned to look at him. They were very close. The fire between them and the stars overhead and the enormous desert dark all around, and the distance between their faces was disappearing by increments in the way that things that have been moving toward each other for a very long time finally do. "4 years is a long time to be alone," she said softly. "It is," he said. "I don't intend to be any more." When he kissed her, it was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who has been certain about something for weeks, and is finally allowing himself to act on that certainty, careful and deliberate and absolutely committed. And she met it with everything she had been keeping behind her wall, which turned out to be considerably more than she had realized. Cal, from his bedroll 20 yards away, pulled his hat down over his eyes and smiled at the inside of the brim. They arrived back in Dusty Creek on Sunday evening, and the town received them with the indifferent practicality of a community that had survived droughts and outlaws and market fluctuations, and was not in the habit of making events of things. Martha Elgin had run the store efficiently in their absence, and had left a note on the counter listing the sales and the complaints, and the single remarkable incident of a man trying to trade a live chicken for tobacco, which she had declined. Sheriff Beckett's office had a lamp burning, which meant he was working late, and Olive stopped in to update him on the outcome in Santa Fe, which he received with the same unhurried competence that characterized everything he did. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at the Dusty Creek post office, which was also Olive's post office, from Philip Garrett, informing her that the petition had been formally withdrawn by Sela's Doyle's attorney. The withdrawal included a notation that the petitioner had declined to contest the counterclaim. Garrett's accompanying note was brief and precise, and had one additional paragraph that she read twice before going to find Aaron. He was in the storage shed behind the store, reorganizing the supply inventory with the systematic attention he brought to physical tasks, and she found him there in the afternoon heat with his sleeves rolled up and an inventory sheet in his hand, and she handed him the letter and watched him read it. He read the main body of the letter first, the withdrawal of the petition, and she watched his face do something quiet and complete, like the closing of a chapter that had been open for a very long time. Then he read Garrett's additional paragraph and his expression changed. "The territorial attorney," he said, "has opened a formal inquiry," she confirmed, "based on the materials filed. Your father's name will be part of that inquiry, Aaron. Whatever comes of it, the record will exist, officially, in the books of the territory." He set the letter down carefully on one of the crates and stood very still for a moment. She did not fill the silence. She understood that this silence was not emptiness but fullness, the kind of fullness that has no words for it and doesn't need them. Then he turned and took her face in his hands, which were warm from the work and rough from years of living outdoors, and he kissed her in the middle of the supply shed in the August heat, with the dust motes turning in the light from the open door and the inventory sheet fluttering to the ground. And she put her hands flat against his chest and kissed him back with the full, unguarded warmth of a woman who has finally, permanently, stopped being careful about this particular thing. From the door of the supply shed, Cal Doyle observed this development, turned around, and went to inform Martha Elgin, who had already suspected and was gratifyingly unsurprised. The weeks that followed had a quality of construction about them, the building of something real and lasting from the materials that two people who have been through something difficult together can make when they decide to make it. Aaron did not move on. He did not pack his bedroll or saddle the bay horse for the road east or west. He rented a proper room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Hendricks, which was a slight step up from the livery stable, and which also had the benefit of being directly across the main road from the Doyle General Store, a proximity that was the subject of considerable discussion at the quilting circle, and which both parties publicly ignored and privately found quite satisfactory. He began, in the evenings and on the days between supply runs, to ride out to the east quarter of the Doyle land. He did not do this with any announcement or fanfare. He simply went, the way a man goes somewhere when he needs to think, taking notes and making observations about the soil and the terrain, and the places where the vegetation suggested subsurface water, in the way his father had taught him to read the land before he could read a book. He shared these observations with Olive in the evenings, spreading his notes out on the store counter the way she spread her accounts, and the conversations they had about what the land might become were some of the best conversations either of them had had in years. It was during one of these evenings, with a fine September rain making a quiet sound on the roof of the store, and the lamplight making the room warm and enclosed and full of the particular comfort of shared purpose, that Aaron Hale, who was not a man who did things without thinking them through, set down his pencil and looked at Olive Doyle and said, "I want to marry you." She had not quite expected the directness of it. She had expected perhaps a more gradual approach, more evenings, more conversations, a slow formal progression through the socially established stages of courtship as they existed in the New Mexico Territory in 1882. She looked at him for a moment with what might have been surprise if you didn't know her, or what was actually, for someone who did know her, pure happiness breaking through a face that was accustomed to composure. "That wasn't a question," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I'll make it one if you prefer." "I prefer to answer the statement," she said. "Yes." He did not have a ring because rings were not something a drifter carried in his saddlebag, but he produced from his vest pocket that vest pocket, the one that had started everything, a small silver pocket watch with a plain back and a mechanism that ran perfectly, which had been his father's. He set it on the counter between them. "Until I can do this properly," he said, I want you to have this, so you have something of his that matters." She picked it up and held it in both hands and felt the weight of it and what the weight meant. "I will take very good care of it," she said. "I know," he said. "You take very good care of everything." They were married in November of 1882 in the Dusty Creek Church, a small adobe building on the north end of the main road that held everyone who wanted to witness it, which turned out to be essentially the entire population of the town. Sheriff Beckett and his wife sat in the front row. Eli Marsh the blacksmith, who was a large man with a quiet heart, stood in the back and blew his nose at the vows and pretended it was the dust. Martha Elgin organized the supper afterward with the efficiency of someone who had been planning it for 3 months, which she had. Cal Doyle, in his role as the only family Olive had to walk with her to the front of the church, did so with a straight back and a full heart, and the look of a young man who is genuinely happy for his sister, and also genuinely delighted to have a brother-in-law who can fix a wagon axle in under an hour. The vows were simple. The promises were not. Aaron Hale stood in that small adobe church and looked at Olive Doyle with the gray eyes that had been watching her with that quiet, complicated expression since the first afternoon on the porch. And his voice, when he spoke the words, was steady and deliberate and entirely without reservation. She held his hands and looked back at him and felt the full resolution of everything. The 6 weeks of careful not quite knowing, the shock of the paper in his pocket, the road to Santa Fe and back, the evening under the stars when they had finally said the plain true things, all of it resolving itself in this moment into something clear and permanent and completely right. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was mild in the territory, mild enough that Aaron began actual work on the East Quarter soil by February, testing and amending, marking the locations where the hand-dug test wells confirmed what the vegetation had suggested about the water table. He was good at it, visibly, remarkably good at it in the way that talent and love of a thing combine to make something that looks effortless from the outside. He and Cal developed a working partnership that had a natural ease to it, different temperaments and different skills that complemented each other without conflict. Aaron deliberate and patient and strategic, Cal quick and physically capable and increasingly interested in the cultivation side of things in a way that neither of them had anticipated. By spring, they had the outline of something real, a small-scale cultivation operation on the East Quarter's best 40 acres, focused on the crops that the soil and water suggested, with expansion planned for the following year. It was not yet profitable, but it was viable and growing, and Aaron's planning was so sound that Philip Garrett, who came to visit in April in connection with the still ongoing territorial attorney inquiry into Sela's, walked the East Quarter and offered an opinion that carried weight coming from a man who was not in the habit of offering unearned praise. The territorial attorney's inquiry, which Aaron followed with close attention through Garrett's reports, reached its formal conclusion in the summer of 1883. The findings were announced through the official record of the New Mexico Territory. Silas Doyle had engaged in a documented pattern of fraudulent land claims in Texas and New Mexico, using misrepresentation of prior financial agreements. The Texas matter was referred to the appropriate authorities in that state, with the New Mexico findings as supporting documentation. The Texas state authorities, presented with the territorial findings and the original Hale affidavits that had waited 4 years in oilcloth in a saddlebag, opened their own inquiry. It took another year for the Texas matter to reach its formal resolution. The land itself was long sold and could not be recovered, but the inquiry produced an official finding in the Texas state records that George Hale had been wrongfully prosecuted on false evidence in 1879, and the record of that prosecution was formally annotated to reflect the fraudulent nature of the complaint against him. George Hale's name was cleared in the official books of Tyler County, Texas, in the summer of 1884. Aaron Hale learned of this through a letter from a Tyler County official, forwarded through Philip Garrett's office, that arrived on a Tuesday morning in August when Olive was at the store counter, and he was in the back room making repairs to the shelving. She read the letter before he came in from the back, understanding its significance from the official letterhead and the first two sentences, and she set it on the counter and waited. He came in from the back with sawdust on his shirt and a level in his hand, and she said, "There is a letter from Texas." He put down the level and came to the counter and picked up the letter and read it. She watched his face with the full attention she had learned to pay to his face in the 2 years she had known it. What she saw was something she had never seen there before and would not forget. The face of a man in the moment when a wound that has been open for years finally, quietly, closes. He set the letter down and was silent for a long time. She came around the counter and stood beside him and put her hand on his back, and he put his arm around her and pulled her close, and she felt the long, slow release of breath that meant the very last of it was finally done. "Your father would be glad," she said. "Yes," he said. "He would." They stood like that for a while in the quiet of the store in the August morning light, with the sounds of the road outside and the town going about its summer business, and the weight of 4 years of carried purpose laid down at last into something permanent and recorded and just. By the fall of 1884, the cultivation operation on the East Quarter had its first profitable harvest. Not a large profit. Aaron had built the projections conservatively, and the reality matched the projections, but real money entered in Olive's ledger in a new column that had not existed before, alongside the store and the postal contract, a third pillar in the structure of the Doyle family enterprise that was now also, in every meaningful sense, the Hale family enterprise. They called it the Hale-Doyle operation, officially in the papers they filed with the county. Both names. Aaron had offered to put her name first. She had told him to put both names together, which was not the same as first or second, but was its own clear statement. Cal had, by now, developed into the kind of young man his father would have recognized immediately capable, hardworking, and increasingly confident in his own direction. In the spring of 1884, he had met a woman named Grace Ellison, who had come to Dusty Creek to work as a schoolteacher, and the fact that Grace Ellison was sharp and funny and interested in things, and not the least bit impressed by being in a frontier town, had apparently been extremely attractive to Cal, because within 6 months of her arrival he was hopelessly devoted to her, and she was tolerating it with evident pleasure. Olive liked Grace enormously. Aaron found her entertaining. The quilting circle approved. In the spring of 1885, Olive and Aaron's son was born. They named him Thomas George Hale, Thomas for her father and George for his. The two men, who had each, in their different ways, made this particular child's parents who they were. He came into the world in the upstairs room of the house that Aaron had been quietly building on the East Quarter for the better part of a year. A solid adobe structure set back from the cultivation fields with good windows on the south side, and a porch that looked out over the land toward the mountains. The midwife, Mrs. Kavanaugh, who had attended half the births in Dusty Creek for 15 years, pronounced it an uncomplicated delivery and a healthy boy with good lungs, and then stepped out to give the parents a moment. And Aaron Hale sat on the edge of the bed with his son in his arms and looked at this small new person with the expression of a man who has arrived at a place he did not know how to imagine when he was on the road to it. Olive, exhausted and clear-eyed and more purely happy than she had ever been in her life, watched him hold their son and thought, "This is what was on the other side of the wall." "Thomas George," Aaron said softly to the baby, who was entirely unimpressed but listening, in the way that newborns listen to voices without comprehension, and yet seem to take something from them nonetheless. "You have a lot of people to live up to. Don't frighten him with that before he's an hour old," Olive said. Aaron looked up at her with a smile that had shed every last element of the careful containment that had characterized his face when he first rode into Dusty Creek, a smile that was full and unguarded and entirely hers. "He'll manage," he said. "He will," she thought, "because look at what he comes from." Cal and Grace were married in October of 1885, in the same small adobe church on the north end of the main road, and the supper afterward was organized by Martha Elgin again, who declared that she expected to be organizing Doyle and Hale family celebrations for the rest of her working life, and considered it a vocation. The house on the East Quarter had a kitchen garden by then, Olive's particular contribution to the agricultural operation, laid out with the same organizational precision she applied to her accounts and her supply shelves. She had given up very little of the store and the postal operation. She was too good at it and too committed to it to cede it entirely, and the community genuinely needed it. But she had found a balance that made room for the house and the garden and Thomas, who grew as babies do with a disregard for anyone's prepared timeline, fast and insistent and entirely himself. By 1887, the cultivation operation had expanded to 110 acres and employed 3 men from town on a seasonal basis. The underground water, which Aaron had located and developed with the patience and skill his father had first taught him, and which he had spent years practicing across 3 states, proved even more reliable than the surveys had suggested. The East Quarter, which Thomas Doyle had said for 20 years was a sin to leave uncultivated, was no longer a sin. It was a living thing, growing season by season, the specific fruit of 4 years of solitary purposeful movement and the decision to stop, finally, in one place. Thomas George Hale, at 2 years old, was an opinionated and energetic presence who had his father's eyes and his mother's capacity for focused attention when something interested him, and a loud, clear voice that carried across the cultivation fields and could be heard from the kitchen garden and sometimes, on still mornings, from the main road. Aaron took him out to the fields on good days, carrying him or letting him walk when the ground was firm, and they spent hours that Aaron would later describe as the best hours of any of his days, moving slowly through the growing things with the small boy observing everything with that concentrated dark-eyed attention. In the summer of 1888, Olive found she was expecting again. She told Aaron in the kitchen of the East Quarter house on a Sunday morning with the warm light of a New Mexico summer coming through the south windows, and he sat down on the kitchen bench with his coffee and looked at her for a moment, and then smiled the full, unguarded smile. "Thomas will have a great deal to say about this," he said. "Thomas has a great deal to say about everything," she said. "He comes by it honestly from both sides." Their daughter was born in February of 1889, in the same upstairs room, attended by the same Mrs. Kavanaugh, who delivered her into the world with the practiced efficiency of long experience, and pronounced her a healthy girl with her father's coloring and her mother's look of knowing exactly what she thought about the situation. They named her Clara Rose, Clara because it meant bright and Rose because Olive had loved that name since she was a child and had been saving it. Aaron held Clara the way he had held Thomas, with the complete focused attention of a man who understands that what is in his hands is the most important thing he has ever handled. And Thomas, who was 3 and extremely interested in proceedings, stood on the bedroom chair beside the bed and regarded his sister with an expression of frank assessment that eventually resolved into what appeared to be acceptance. "Small," he announced. "She'll grow," Aaron told him. "Like the wheat," Thomas said, with the satisfied logic of a child whose entire conceptual world included cultivation. "Yes," Aaron said, "exactly like the wheat." Olive looked at her husband and her son and her daughter from her position on the pillows with the clarity of a woman who has, through a combination of courage and love, and the willingness to trust a man whose vest pocket had once held the most frightening paper she had ever read, arrived at a life that is exactly what a life should be. The store on the main road of Dusty Creek continued to operate, as it had operated under Thomas Doyle, and as it would continue to operate under Olive for years to come, a fixed point in the community, practical and necessary and quietly central to the daily life of the town. The lending library along the back wall grew. Aaron contributed to it regularly, which was something Olive had not asked for but which delighted her every time a new volume appeared on the shelf. The postal contract was renewed without incident. The supply runs continued, though Aaron was no longer the one making them, that role having passed to a capable young man from the south end of town, named Henry Voss, who had the same combination of reliability and good judgment that Aaron had once brought to the work. Sheriff Frank Beckett retired in 1889, and his replacement was a solid man from Albuquerque whom the community quickly accepted, because Dusty Creek had reached the age when it had enough history and enough stake in its own continuity to be discerning about its civic institutions. The Quilting Circle added 3 new members and continued to be the primary news organization of the community, operating with a speed and accuracy that the Albuquerque newspaper could not match for local matters. Cal and Grace had a son in 1887, named after Grace's father, and were expecting a second child in 1889. Cal had grown into the Hale-Doyle operation with a wholeheartedness that had surprised some people who remembered him as primarily horse-focused, and had surprised nobody who had paid close attention. He was good with the land and good with the men who worked it, and he and Aaron had the kind of working partnership that only forms between people who genuinely respect each other's way of doing things, which is less common than it should be and worth preserving when it occurs. The silver pocket watch that had been George Hale's and then Aaron's and then Olive's on a November evening at the store counter during a fine September rain, that watch lived on the mantel of the East Quarter house, wound every Sunday, keeping perfect time. Olive had, in the spring of 1886, commissioned a silversmith in Albuquerque to engrave the back, which had been plain. The engraving said, GH to AH to OH, 3 generations of carrying, and now set down. Aaron noticed it the Sunday she brought it home from the supply run where she had picked it up. He held it and read the back and looked at her with the expression she had learned to love best in his face, the one that had nothing to do with composure or caution or the careful management of feeling, the one that was just him, fully present and fully meaning it. That is exactly right, he said. I thought so, she said. There were evenings in the years that followed when they would sit on the porch of the East Quarter house with Thomas asleep inside and Clara growing, and the stars coming out over the territory, and Olive would think about the afternoon she had stood on the porch of the store and watched a lean, weather-beaten man on a dark bay horse ride into Dusty Creek and said, it was, until the dust came. She thought about how close she had come to not knowing any of it, how easily she might have remained behind her wall, how the paper in his vest pocket, the most frightening thing she had ever read, had turned out to be the first true thing, the document that made everything else possible. Nobody had warned her, that was the simple fact of it. Nobody had told her that the drifter passing through on a July afternoon had been carrying her family's name across 3 states for years, had been tracking a ghost through Amarillo and Santa Fe, and Tucson with the names Doyle and Hale and debt written in pencil columns, moving through the territory with a purpose that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with justice, and that those 2 things, justice for the dead and love for the living, were going to arrive in her store at the same time in the form of a man with gray eyes and a 3-day beard, and a dark bay horse with an easy rolling gait. Nobody had warned her. But she had learned something, in the years since the July afternoon and the September rain and the Santa Fe road and the paper in the pocket, that she considered worth keeping. The things that change your life seldom arrive with a warning. They arrive as ordinary Tuesday mornings or strangers who need water, as papers falling out of pockets and letters that have been waiting 8 weeks to be understood. They arrive in the form of a man who says the wanting is the most honest thing I've done in 4 years, and means it. She sat on the porch of the house her husband had built on the land her father had left her, with the sound of her children sleeping inside, and the New Mexico night enormous and full of stars around her. And Aaron came out and sat beside her with his coffee. And the quiet that she had learned was not the quiet of withholding, but the quiet of a man who is entirely at rest. And she leaned against him and felt his arm come around her. And the watch on the mantelpiece inside ticked steadily in the dark. And the East Quarter fields were green in the moonlight, and the territory stretched out in every direction into the beautiful, incomprehensible dark, and everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved, and every door that needed to be opened was open, and there was nothing left to carry for either of them that was not worth carrying. She found his hand in the dark and held it. He held hers back. The night was very large and very quiet and entirely full.